an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. Look at that. The 29th day of September. Welcome in. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And it has been a quiet summer at Queen's Park. So we're just going to look forward to what might be coming up. We are joined, as usual, by John Wright from Maru Public Opinion. Sabrina Nanji is here, the publisher and founder of the Queen's Park Observer. And Keith Leslie, veteran reporter from Queen's Park, was the bureau chief for Canadian Press for years, and now you hear and see him on CH television. And, it's funny, when we kind of put this thing to bed back, I guess, at the end of June, things were kind of settling in, but Greenbelt was just still percolating. We thought, could it be, couldn't it be? And Sabrina, the premier, was very adamant in terms of, we're all doing the right thing. Steve Clark was there dancing in step with the premier, and we were all doing the right thing. We're building more houses. And the feeling was that they were going to get through this summer without any real issues. I don't know, you would know better than I because you've been following it on a daily basis, but it felt like every 2 or 3 days for the next 4 or 5 weeks, there wasn't just a wrinkle in the story. There was a major dumpster fire development that has just got this fog now hanging over the premier. I mean, he went into the summer with some pretty decent approval ratings. He's now kind of in, I won't say free fall, but he's in the most political jeopardy he has been in probably since the Dean French days.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely been the premier's summer of discontent, and it's been a whirlwind. I mean, someone the other day sort of had to remind me that the PCs, lost the pair of by-elections in Scarborough and Ottawa this summer, and I was like, oh yeah, that
too
felt like a lifetime ago, right?
Yeah.
And so you're right, and I think they've sort of been owning themselves a little bit and made this a lot worse than it really needed to be. I mean, once these reports from the Auditor General, the Integrity Commissioner came out, there's still some more reports coming. The RCMP is still sniffing around. So it's not over yet, but once these came out, I mean, they were really digging in their heels, and it seemed inevitable that they were going to have to eventually change course on the Greenbelt, which they did, but that wasn't, until after weeks of saying, I have full confidence in my minister. And then days later, the minister's gone. They've lost a housing minister, Steve Clark, the public and business service delivery minister, Khalid Rashid, after, that sketchy Vegas trip where he couldn't really get his story straight under oath to the Integrity Commissioner. He's no longer even sitting on the PC benches at all. And a pair of top staffers have left. So I think that it was inevitable, but still no less stunning of the fact that the Ford government has had to change course, and now they've sort of gone into overkill here. I mean, we talk a lot on this podcast about how the opposition has been weakened, and of course, the Ford government has a majority. I actually think NDP leader Mart Stiles has been doing a good job of holding the premier's feet to the fire in question period when the House, revved back up this week. But the Conservatives are also talking about this quite a bit, and I guess keeping it fresh in the public's mind. Like, they're now talking about legislation to codify the Greenbelt boundaries and, make sure that no future government can do what the premier did after promising he wouldn't do it. So it's like, this is something,
and saying it was okay, standing behind it, by the way, all up until last Thursday.
Right. Yeah. And this is something that is typically done in regulation. And so the fact that they're putting it in legislation, going to have some debate. I mean, this is really just keeping an issue alive that they don't want. They need to change the narrative, stick to pocketbook issues, cost of living, the housing crisis, and we've sort of seen them, do that spin. But I really think this was a failure of issues management. I mean, of course, beyond the ethics questions, the policy questions, the flip-flopping, this is a major issues management problem. And really, Tory circles at Queen's Park are asking, like, who's in charge here? Because the premier has in the past been pretty good at shutting down so-called scandals. I mean, he's reversed course when the public has backlashed quickly enough and put it to bed. But this one just seems to be a growing headache, and I don't think it's going to be over anytime soon. Well,
and Keith, when we talk about the flip-flop, and he came out and he had the nerve to say, we've listened to you and we've heard you. Where the hell have you been for 18 months? Well, when they first came out back and said we were going to start to look at this, it was evident that there were people who were going to say, hey, hang on for a minute. The Star and I think the National Observer had done some, in-depth reporting on who was involved with 413, with the Greenbelt. So there was a fair amount of tinder already there, just waiting to be lit on fire. To have the nerve to stand in front of the media, in Niagara and say, we heard your complaints and now we're responding to you. It was tone deaf.
Well, it totally was. But I mean, he, in his mind, he was doing the big climb down. So anything he said after that was gravy. I mean, he was trying to change the narrative as we've just heard. What surprised me more than anything, it just seemed inevitable to almost everyone from the very beginning of this, once word really got out and sunk in that the only way out of this for the PC government, for Premier Ford, was to just do what he inevitably ended up doing, backtrack completely, putting those lands back into the Greenbelt and vowing never to touch them again. Why did it take him so long? Why did they think they could ride it out? That was one thing. But then when they got pushed, remember, as you said, his thing was to stand by his ministers, stand by Ryan Amato, stand behind these people initially. Then he doubled down. Okay, then we're going to open up the entire Greenbelt. We're going to look at all 600 applications we've had. So before he actually did the climb down, they doubled down again. And it's like someone was giving them some really, really bad advice, or the issues management people were just completely out to lunch on this, because it was, as I say, obvious to everyone from the get-go. The only way out of this was to completely reverse course. Now they're going further. They're going to codify it so no one else can ever do what they did. We're going to pass the Ford law to stop you from doing what the Ford government did. What I found most galling, though, Dave, when you asked about that Niagara Falls announcement when he stood there, was he claimed this was leadership. That's what leadership is.
Yeah.
It's a new definition of leadership, I think, for most of us. And the cabinet that he was leading, who were forced to stand behind him in Niagara Falls, with a 10-foot
pole between him and them, you noticed.
That was one grim-looking group. And as the best take I saw on it was someone posted as the cabinet was walking into place there behind him in Niagara Falls, they posted it to Benny Hill's theme song.
Of course.
And it kind of looked like, it was a bit of a clown show, wasn't it, in the end? And especially what I say, him claiming this is what leadership is, when I admit my mistakes and turn around and reverse course. Your mistakes were clear for months and months and months, and your government was taking it on the chin to the point where it took a 2-day caucus meeting for your PC members. Apparently, some of them finally got a bit of spine and said, this is killing us. Mm-hmm. All summer long, we're getting our butts handed to us. It has to stop, and there's only one way to make it stop, and you know what it is. Do it.
Well, and then the funny thing is, and John, I saved you to last because I know you're going to take the long look on this as you normally do. We're still 3 years out from an election, but have you ever seen anything like this at Queen's Park? I mean, there have been scandals and there have been issues with ministers, but wow.
Well, I started as a parliamentary intern in 1980, and there was one there was called Astor Trust Raymore. I've seen, we can go all the way back there, and then we can forward from there, and there have been lots of scandals and lots of difficulties and riots and a whole bunch of stuff. And I think we always have to look at, how much time do politicians have, because the opposition may change or whatever it is. And I reflect on a couple of things. Number one, we do have an election, as you said, in 2026. I mean, that's a lifetime from now. That's a change of the premier staff, maybe once or twice. It's got lots of change that could be done for issues and focus. So there's, and to Sabrina's point as well, this issue has more legs on it, probably, because it's got a bunch of loose ends that are going to have to be tied up. But let's project out further down the line. And when it comes to elections, it's always a choice between one person who leads a party and the other ones. So we do have time. Number two, it does take away from your agenda. I mean, you're constantly fighting one fire and there are a bunch of others burning and you can't get moving on to things. And so after this one, it's going to be, as Olivia Chow now is putting it, why don't you move that spa across the street and leave Ontario Place as it is? I mean, these are things that we've noticed for the last year or so that are going to suddenly keep going. Number three, Vegas is a bad spot to be in. I remember Councillor Tom Jacobek from Toronto in a plane that went for a junket down to Las Vegas, and he ended up getting bounced as deputy mayor, and a whole bunch of other people on that plane who I will not mention got away with, we're all politicals, but got away with no dirt on them. But, once you get people doing things that are untoward, it's a bit of a culture issue, right? Like it's an entitlement issue, and you've got to stamp that out. You've got to bring some people in with integrity. Number four, Paul Calandra is the cleanup guy. I mean, if anybody takes a file, as soon as he arrived on the scene, I knew that it was going to get buttoned down, and whether he in fact has proposed the legislation, which is a bit of overreach, but there you go. He manages to take these issues and clean them up and move on, whether it's long-term care or any other issue. He's the guy in the seat. I think the difficulty for the Ford government right now, and there is an opportunity, is that they're not getting out of anything. They're now in the House. So, as we've all noted here, the opposition is going to be hammering at them, and with some success. The only thing that I'm interested in is seeing where the Liberals end up with their leadership, because that then brings a whole new level of scrutiny, not just to what the Liberals want to put on the table, but also their new leader. And I think there's some vulnerabilities there. And I think the Tories have already signaled it with their advertising, their social advertising it's all about Bonnie. They've zeroed in on a personality trait here that I think they're going to try and use. But to put it in perspective, I don't think they get out of this until at least Christmas and the New Year. I think they're going to have to run with this, and it's going to be Ontario Place next. But I think their long-term thing is 2026 is a lifetime away.
Yeah, and I want to get to the Liberal piece in a second, but I think to John's point, Sabrina, Paul Calandra, I wouldn't call him the fixer. He's certainly taken the steam out of some of the issues, because that has happened with long-term care. I'm not confident that the long-term care system is any better than it was a year ago, but he's got the right people in the right place. I think you reported on this week, just saying, his team seems to be in a place where they're able to just bring the temperature down. And that's what has to happen right now with housing and with the Greenbelt. He seems to be stick handling that fairly effectively. On the other hand, you also noted that they were out with fundraising emails this week and saying, we're still the team to get it done. So it's this contradictory messaging, even going to the core, just seems to be problematic for them.
Yeah, I will say that fundraising email that was signed by Doug Ford, it rattled off a list of accomplishments and, we've got the right team to get it done. But interestingly, it didn't include housing, because we all know what happened to Clark there. And yeah, I do agree that Paul Calandra has been the troubleshooter for this government. He's got a new chief of staff. It was just confirmed today, Michael Klementowski, who was also Calandra's chief of staff at long-term care. And you're right, I'm not saying that file is fixed by any means, but certainly they've managed to put out some fires, and they've been on this streak of announcements for new beds in, all across the province. And so they have managed to clean it up. That's what I keep hearing about Calandra's new chief, is that he's going to clean house. And of course, as we know, that file really, really could use some outside perspective, but yeah, you're right. I think that they've kind of been brushing it off. I mean, we've seen the opposition really hold Doug Ford's feet to the fire here and sort of zero in on some of the more questionable aspects of these integrity commissioner reports that we've gotten. And I will say about those reports, it kind of felt like the ethics watchdog, J. David Wake, has been leaving this trail of breadcrumbs for us, because our watchdogs really don't have very strong teeth at Queen's Park. I mean, there's only so much they can do. The premier likes to say that he was totally cleared in the latest, report from the watchdog, but that's not, take that with a grain of salt, because the watchdog basically said that, there's only so much scope that I have here. And, based on that, I can't really dig into the premier necessarily further. I mean, specifically, this was a complaint from the NDP about the stag and doe, and the fact that, MPPs and maybe their spouses have rules about the gifts they can accept, but it doesn't really extend to more family members. And so the premier's daughter, if she was getting, tickets bought to her stag and doe from developers, like that's not really under the watchdog's purview. But he did point out, as an interesting point, not something he had to do, but the fact that the PC's party fundraiser, Tony Miele, was selling tickets to this. And I think that, at least from what I've heard, the buzz around Queen's Park is that there are enough details in these reports, including, that sketchy Vegas trip that a developer who stood to benefit from these land swaps went to with, two of the premier's aides and a minister, and the integrity commissioner suggested the developer was tipped off that these lands were going to become very lucrative. I mean, it does seem to be enough information that at least, journalists can go digging around. And I know, myself and my colleagues are trying to probe further. And also the RCMP, like this might be enough information for the RCMP to go to a judge and say, listen, we need a warrant here to sort of, go searching further. Now, this is all, speculative at this point. That's why I say this really isn't over yet for the Ford government. But to John's point about whether this is going to stick to the premier, I think that, yes, 2026 is a long ways out. But at the end of the day, what's still top of mind to most people in the province is not being able to afford groceries, is, housing affordability. And, we've had so many reports that say that the Greenbelt lands were not needed for this ambitious housing goal from the province, which, it already seems far-fetched because there hasn't been enough housing starts to sort of, hit the targets that they're talking about so far, but it still seems possible. So if the premier can kind of pull this housing feat out of his hat by 2026, I think that the public will be forgiving on it. I think what's going to really be their undoing is if, and it's a big if at this point, the RCMP ends up laying criminal charges on somebody. I think that's going to be their downfall here.
Well, let me go the other side of this then, Keith, and suggest that we have wasted 18 months in terms of the housing file, that in fact, whether it was just, preparation, whatever, that's one problem. The other issue we're hearing, a lot of developers have had approvals, but there's no shovels in the ground. And primarily the answer seems to be it's costing us too much because of interest rates right now. Cost us more than we had anticipated in terms of the project. So there are other things at play here, whether it's regulation or the provincial initiative. I think the reality is that this whole Greenbelt distraction has in fact stunted any kind of progress that we need on housing. And we already knew, even before the last election, that the ambitious, the nature of the goals were really ambitious, that we hadn't come close to that in the last decade in terms of the number of houses we wanted built. So there's two things there. Is there enough runway left to be able to even get close, or some momentum that's going to save this housing initiative politically? And the second thing is, does Doug Ford have the stamina for this right through until 2026? That's a long way away.
That's my big question. Doug Ford does not like being disliked, and he's getting hammered over this Greenbelt. And he's going to continue to for quite some time yet. Because remember, it's not just the Greenbelt. There was some forced land expansions, boundary expansions in Ottawa and Hamilton at the same time, the same dates, and again incorporating Greenbelt land. All of this is going to keep being dragged out. That Vegas vacay stinks to high heaven. I mean, and there's a reason, I think, like when the last details of that came out, it was the next day that the premier climbed down, and it was the weekend before the legislature came back. And I think that was just, they knew the details of this, the fact that 2 premier staffers from the premier's office and a former very close confidant of the premier, who's now a land developer with the Greenbelt, and a cabinet minister, not only went to Vegas, I mean, we have to bring it up. They lied about it to the integrity commissioner, and then, said, oh, we were surprised to meet him in the lobby of the hotel. Turns out they then went for joint massages together. And I assure our listeners that none of this podcast members here would do that. Even if we did go to Vegas together.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that visual.
Oh, come on. I mean, that was so ludicrous, and the salacious details of that are still to come. I mean, and as Sabrina pointed out, the integrity commissioner pointed right to this and said, this particular developer, I am convinced, well, I don't know if to say convinced, I was pretty sure it was tipped off. Don't know how or by whom. And this, to say the premier was cleared, well, what they said was, we can't define that the premier was involved in the actual selection of these particular lands. I don't know if that's absolutely clearing you. I want to mention one thing about Calandra. He is the ultimate wet blanket on a story. He put out fires all right. He just puts out everyone. He'll just talk you to death to the point where you just, please stop. Don't talk about this. We won't report on it anymore. He's like the Herb Gray used to be for the federal Liberals at one point. I mean, Jim Bradley was for the Ontario Liberals. I'll talk to you. Sure, I'll talk to you. I won't answer any of your questions. I'm going to talk about Betty from Freeland, who had just these stories and rambling and going on and never getting back to the point. And, oh, yeah, and you guys screwed it all up when you were in government and we're better. I mean, he's just so good at that. But literally, in the legislature, even I'm sure people are watching and, okay, stop. Let's not ask him any more questions because we just don't want to hear him going on about this. They've gone too far. Well,
yeah, but I agree with you. I mean, they used to have Herb Gray, who they called Gray Herb, if I'm not mistaken at the time. And he was House Leader, Calandra, and it settled a whole lot of things down. I mean, he has been the wet blanket, no question about that. But I want to come back to the housing issue and a couple of other things. Number one, I mean, the Ford government has given powers to cities to change things and to go ahead. They've got strong mayor powers. I mean, we have Olivia Chow meeting with the Minister of Housing on Thursday to try and get things moving. And on Friday, she meets with Krista Freeland. Ironically, she goes to Ottawa to meet with people and then has to meet with the Deputy Prime Minister and finance person here back on Friday. But, I mean, those wheels are moving as well. But I think the common perception of people is actually going to land, shoot me if you want, but is going to actually land on the desk of Mark Miller, the new Minister of Immigration. I think there's going to be an issue which comes up that says, look, we've opened the floodgates to too many people who are coming into cities, and to expand the availability of housing, it's putting pressure on everything from universities to rental spaces, blah, blah, blah. But I suspect there's going to be something like that. And it's going to actually, for the Trudeau government, my federal perspective at the moment is that the Nazi issue in the House of Commons is actually going to take focus off of a lot of domestic things and put us on our international brand. I think that's going to kill Trudeau more than anything else, where if you're excluded and embarrassed and all that sort of thing, Canadians are going to say enough about this, and there you go. But I think the housing issue is a complex one, and it's going to come down to, at the end of the day, a lot of the cities making decisions about whether they're going to cut through their own red tape. You and I know that if you try and get anything done in zoning in any of these cities, whether it be London or Toronto or anything like you might as well go and put the stopwatch on the next 30 years before you get anything done. There are lots of lands available and lots of things to be done that I think, it's going to come down to the individual cities, and, the province can say, we've done everything we can. It's up to the cities to put the shovels in the ground. But reverse back to where we were on this thing. I don't think we're finished with the issue itself. I think, again, if you're constantly fighting fires in the rear, you can't put a flashlight in the front. You can't kind of say, well, this is the issue that we're dealing with. In the crosstown link, that's, my God. I mean, it's like, it was like that joke years ago where, somebody goes up to see God and he's sitting there and he says, when will Canada figure out the issue of separation in Quebec? And it says, and God looks at him and said, well, not in my lifetime. It's kind of it's kind of an issue here. Like, I don't know. We have irony at the top of my street is the Avenue Road, Eglinton, Chaplin Station area. We have these gorgeous, gleaming station fronts that are ready and open for people to go in. And I don't think I'll ever see in my lifetime a connectivity that makes this thing work. And you got somebody who's earning close to $1 million a year who comes out every once in a while like a groundhog and says, I'm sorry, I can't tell you when we're going to be finished. That is outrageous. That's the sort of thing that turns to the Ford government and say, hey, if you're the stick it in the ground shovels guy and you can't get this thing done, then fire somebody and get on with it. But I think that these are the issues that get people as opposed to something more abstract.
Yeah, well, and it's, I was talking to David Coletto last week, and when we got into this conversation, and I think, John, you've touched on this in the past, where people are starting to get politically activated, not necessarily by political stripe, but by issue. Uh-huh. And it's less sort of vertical. It's more of a horizontal view of how we're going to engage with politics. So it's there still will be a core for all of the parties, but then there's that kind of area of the atmosphere where people are kind of floating from one issue to the other. So you might have, a committed Tory who's really pissed off about what's going on with Crosstown and the Greenbelt.
And Ontario Place, these 95-year secret leases, all this stuff.
Right, all of this stuff. So you got to want, and I kind of come back to that, it may be overly dramatic, but I think you brought it up. What the hell's going on? Who's leading the ship here, Sabrina? I don't know that Doug Ford has the appetite or the long-term political aspiration to put up with this for another 3 years, because the heat's not going to come out of this.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually heard that the premier is really stressed about what's happening right now. Everyone can tell he's kind of taking it out on people. He's got a short fuse these days. And there's always these evergreen rumors that he won't run again in 2026. There's always this speculation that will he run federally, but I think we've kind of been talking about it now. This has become a major credibility issue for the Ford government. I mean, as soon as they did the 180 on the Greenbelt, everyone who's opposed to what's happening with Ontario Place was we just got to push hard enough and they're going to change their mind on this. And I mean, a lot of the Tories that I talk to, the ones who aren't necessarily drinking the Kool-Aid with Doug Ford, it is what does this government stand for? What is this government's legacy? They have this whopping majority, and what are they doing with it? I mean, they've kind of been tinkering around with City Hall. They've that sort of backfired on them. They capped those wages. A lot of these things that they're becoming known for are still battles in the courts. But from what I hear, what the premier wants his legacy to be is this change at Ontario Place. It's the Ontario line as well, and I think if he can get that done. I mean, Toronto Transit is kind of a mess right now and is in need of some relief, but that's a big if. I mean, just look at what's happening with the Crosstown. And also it was going to be privatizing healthcare. And we saw this week boosting the private sector's delivery of public healthcare. And we saw this week, this huge protest. I mean, the Ontario Health Coalition, a lot of unions were out there railing against this. And it does seem like that's something that's really precious to the public. And maybe John will know more about this, but I think that our healthcare system is in shambles right now. And there's this real concern that, private companies, while I do agree we need some help here, there's this concern that private companies will be more concerned about their bottom line than about, patient outcomes. And so I do think that Doug Ford is really going to, stick his heels in the mud and try and get these projects moving forward. But as you said, just like with the housing, we're close to halfway through the mandate, and what's been done. I think that it feels like a waste of a majority here for a lot of conservatives, even small C conservatives, non-Ford Nation people. And I think that this is kind of the in that the Liberals might have as an alternative as they're trying to mount a comeback.
Well, Ford's now a drag on them. Ford's a drag on his own caucus. And so whether or not he wants to run in 2026, maybe the caucus will have a different opinion before then. because this definition of leadership of I've admitted my mistake and we can go on, move forward now. No, and it's going to continue to haunt him. If we said there's so much coming, especially if that RCMP investigation turns into a full-fledged investigation, they start seeking warrants or whatever. This is not something this government can get out from underneath, not in any short time. And I think it's just going to continue to hurt the backbench so much. I don't think that a Conservative can stick their head up anywhere locally without getting chewed up, from the public about this Greenbelt stuff. You promised us, it was a broken promise to begin with. You videotape with these developers. That videotape still just plays, and I think it's going to, as Sabrina said, embolden the Ontario Place people who are opposed to what's going on there. And I think Olivia Chow has proposed a really reasonable alternative at this point. The Highway 413, the same developers involved going through some of the Greenbelt lands again. Secrecy, secrecy, secrecy. Enough people have had enough, and this government, Ford himself, as I said, he can't stand not being liked. All of this is just putting him further and further into that corner and making him the bigger millstone around the neck of the Conservative Party. They need to reclaim their brand as the PC Party of Ontario and get rid of this Ford Nation nonsense.
So, Sabrina, what's worse? What's more damaging then? Is it the possibility that the Integrity Commissioner could still order a public inquiry here, which would be unwieldy, never mind, versus an RCMP investigation? Because if there's a public inquiry, the Premier is going to be at the center of that. It doesn't necessarily mean the Premier's at the center of an RCMP investigation.
Yeah, and I think I kind of wanted to jump back in off of Keith's point too, because I think this is all connected. Like, politically, the most damaging thing for Ford is that this stuff really sticks to him because caucus is already not happy. I mean, we talked about that retreat in Niagara Falls and that, ministerial backdrop. I mean, Monty McNaughton wasn't in it, and then he resigned, and talk about bad timing because everyone's speculating, does this have to do with the Greenbelt stuff? I keep hearing people are adamant it was really about his family, but there's still this speculation that McNaughton, who has run for leader in the past, he's one of the more affable ministers. He's made some serious headway with unions, mainly private sector unions. A lot of, labor advocates say it's a lot of low-hanging fruit that the Ford government has done with their so-called working for workers legislation. But that was still significant for the Conservatives, and those relationships really helped the PCs, poach seats from the NDP, like Timmins, Windsor. They got some suburban spots in Brampton too. And so Monty's exit was a huge loss, and people are speculating, even though Monty says he's not coming back to politics, he's joining the private sector, that this would be a way for him to sort of leave, wait till, the PCs knife Ford, if that's a big if, but caucus is already unhappy with the way things have been going because they've been hearing from their own constituents, what the hell's up with the Greenbelt. But this kind of paves the way for possibly, if Ford wasn't going to be leader in 2026, let's say he decides to run for mayor, that Monty McNaughton could possibly come back and be one of the people that runs for leader without having the Ford government's baggage that undoubtedly a lot of them will have carrying with them. And people like the finance minister, Peter Bethlen-Falvey, Caroline Mulrooney, they could get better paying jobs, in the private sector. They don't really need to be part of this circus right now in the government. And so I think that not only does Ford have a lot of making up to do with the public, and Keith's right, all politicians want to be loved, but Ford is unique in that he really needs to be loved. It's just by who? Is it by developers? Is it by the people? But I do think that he's got some making up to do, not only with the public, but certainly with his caucus and caucus management, throughout the years hasn't exactly been one of his best feats. And I think that's just because he's not exactly, a partisan guy. He comes from City Hall, and he likes to, march to the beat of his own drum, and he's got his people close with him, and it's Ford Nation.
John, before we go, I think we need to kind of just take a look down the telescope to December, and as we speak, Adil Shamji has stepped away from the Liberal leadership, and it was interesting to hear his comment, essentially saying this is the best way for me to promote my own agenda in terms of what we need in the province. And he's an emergency room doctor and so on. Embraced immediately by Bonnie Crombie. He's endorsing her for the leadership. Back to your point, this can only mean to me that Crombie is even more in the heads of Doug Ford and the Tories at Queen's Park.
Yeah, well, there's two things that go on at this time. First of all, there's lots of speculation as to who's ahead and who's not, and there's only one person who you can see is ahead, and that's the person who is selling the most membership. So let's put that on the table. And then there's people who don't sell enough memberships, who believe that that there's an opportunity that if they side early enough with the potential person who's going to win, that they have an opportunity to be in cabinet or the deputy leader or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of politics that's all very local within selling the memberships, and so we'll have to see where that all ends up at the end of the day. I think the second thing, though, is that Bonnie Crombie will be defined by Doug Ford's people right away. They're going to paint her wagon before she gets a chance to paint her own. And they've already started doing that because they basically said, look, she's all about her and she's not about you. And as it'll be interesting to see then, well, she's got to get a seat. I recall recently that there was a conservative leader who didn't get a seat and then lost his own and by his own making in Toronto. So, I mean, things happen, but I think you're right. Between now and the end of the year, it's going to be about trying to repair caucus, spiraling damage on issues and trying to get focused. And that will be the great thing where they can, go home for Christmas, kiss the year goodbye, start fresh in the next number of months. When the House comes back, you got a budget and you can go through, and hopefully you've then got an opposition leader that you can define between the end of the year and the beginning of the sitting. So they still have time, because who controls when a by-election is going to be, right? And you probably won't want to give that away anytime soon. So there is, as I said from the very outset of this podcast, time matters. Time matters because it's 2026. They don't have to go until that time. But between now and probably the spring of this coming year is the rehabilitation time. And also, as I said, I think there's a lot of loose ends here that may, come back to haunt them.
So, Keith, let's assume that, take a real leap here and suggest that Bonnie Crombie is going to be the next leader of the Liberal Party in Ontario. Is she better to hold that office outside of the legislature and wait until she knows that one of the sitting Liberals says, I'm not going to run again, so that then she'll run in that whatever in the next election? Or does she have more firepower outside the legislature rather than trying to spend it on a by-election?
It would depend. I think if this Greenbelt issue is still as hot as it is now, if there's still things percolating, the MZOs that were given out to specific developers, all this kind of, if it's still percolating, she'd be better off in the House, because it's tough to get media attention outside the House. Yes, you can build up your brand and go and visit every community in Ontario, but she's already doing that. I think at this point, my advice would be, get in the legislature as soon as you can, start hammering away at Doug Ford, show the people of Ontario that you're the one that can take on Doug Ford. Merritt Stiles, as Sabrina said, has done a bang-up job this week. I kind of was disappointed they didn't use every question on Monday about the Greenbelt, or maybe one on the health protest, but they've been and Tuesday they got into the Vegas vacation stuff and really started nailing it down. The questions were excellent. The responses were either none by the Premier, or you get up and said, I've been cleared, and let Calandra put a wet blanket on everything else. They're bang on. I think this is going to have to change, and change quickly, but for her, I would try and get in the House if she becomes a leader, or any leader at this point. Although if it's Yasser Naqvi, say, who's not nearly as well known despite having been an attorney general, maybe his time would be better spent building up the Liberal brand outside the House. But if this, as I say, if the Greenbelt issue is still, if Doug Ford is still as on the ropes as he is now, if I were Crombie, I'd get in there and show I'm as strong or even better than Merritt Stiles at holding this guy to account.
Sabrina?
I think it depends. I actually don't think it's necessary for Bonnie Crombie. I mean, I think it would be good to be touring the province, fundraising, building up the cash arsenal that they're going to need, introducing herself, defining herself. I mean, that's kind of like politics 101. You have to define yourself before your rivals can. And I think Bonnie's already late to the game on that one. But yeah, I think that if there was a Mississauga spot that opened up, why not run? But, don't forget, the Liberals don't have recognized status in the House. And so it's not like they really get a lot of opposition questions. But, those clips of Bonnie Crombie, yelling at the Premier, I think would be useful in any campaign. So it really depends. I think if the spot opens up, she should take the opportunity, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be damaging for her if she doesn't have a seat and just waits until 2026.
Well, we've got lots of time in between now and then to kind of kick that around. And, of course, they will announce the Liberal leader in, I guess, that first week of December. So we'll be watching all of that with interest. John, Keith, Sabrina, it's great to see you. Great to have the fire back on the podcast again. We'll talk to you guys next week. Thanks.
Take care.
Cheers.
Thanks.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.